By the time the truth arrived in Riverbend, it was already too late to matter. It came quietly, without urgency, like a visitor who shows up after the house is burned down, polite, apologetic, and useless. People nodded when they heard it. Some frowned. A few said, "That's unfortunate." Then they returned to their routines, relieved that the story was finally settled. What no one asked was whether the truth had arrived in time. Because long before facts could explain anything, a whisper had already done its work. In Riverbend, whispers were never considered dangerous. They were treated like weather, unpredictable, unavoidable, and no one's responsibility. People spoke freely, trusting that if something truly mattered, it would eventually correct itself. It rarely did. Evelyn Harper had lived in Riverbend her entire life, and she had grown up believing that silence was a kind of kindness. She wasn't shy, exactly, just deliberate. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way others chose clothes, not to stand out, not to offend, and never to draw unnecessary attention. People trusted her because she didn't exaggerate. When Evelyn spoke, it was usually because she felt it mattered. Her mornings began the same way each day. She woke before the sun, brewed coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while the town still slept. The early light softened everything: houses, streets, even regrets. In those moments, the world felt manageable, as if nothing had yet gone wrong. At the community health clinic where she worked, Evelyn was known for her calm presence. She treated sprains, fevers, and fatigue, but her real skill was noticing what patients avoided saying. She recognized grief in the way someone held their shoulders, fear in how long they hesitated before answering simple questions. Listening had become second nature to her. She believed that listening was enough. The afternoon everything changed did not announce itself. It was late. The clinic had stayed open longer than usual, and Evelyn was tired. She locked the back door and reached for her bag when she heard voices nearby, tucked behind the building where the alley narrowed and conversations hid. She did not intend to listen. But voices have a way of reaching those who are quiet. Two people stood near the fence, speaking in low, hurried tones. Their words overlapped, rushed by urgency rather than clarity. Evelyn caught only fragments. A name surfaced: Michael Reed. Then another word followed, blurred by distance and timing, but it sounded uncomfortably like theft. Her body stilled. She did not step closer. She did not strain to hear more. Something in her resisted the instinct to complete the picture. She told herself she had heard too little to understand anything at all. Still, the incomplete thought lodged itself in her mind. Michael Reed was new to Riverbend. He had arrived months earlier as a volunteer teacher, helping children who struggled with reading and writing. He was polite, reserved, and almost painfully earnest. Evelyn had seen him around town, always carrying books, always greeting people with a smile that seemed to ask permission to exist. The idea that his name could be linked to wrongdoing felt wrong. On her walk home, Evelyn tried to shake the thought loose. The town looked the same as it always had: storefronts closing, neighbors exchanging greetings, the river moving steadily past the old bridge. Nothing suggested that anything fragile was about to break. That evening, she met her friend Claire Thompson at a cafe near the square. It was a familiar ritual. They talked about work, about the town council, about people they both knew. And then, without planning to, Evelyn mentioned what she had heard. "I overheard something odd today," she said, wrapping her hands around her cup. She hesitated, then added, "It's probably nothing." She lowered her voice. "I didn't hear the whole conversation. I could be wrong." She believed that saying those words, "probably nothing could be wrong," would protect her. That uncertainty would neutralize harm. But once spoken, a sentence no longer belongs to the speaker. Claire leaned forward, curiosity flickering across her face. She asked a question. Then another. Evelyn answered cautiously, repeating her doubts, emphasizing how incomplete the information was. Yet each repetition stripped the sentence of its hesitation. That night, Evelyn slept soundly. She had not accused anyone. She had not insisted on truth. She had merely shared concern, framed carefully in uncertainty. By morning, the town had removed the caution. The story moved quickly, passing from voice to voice, house to house. The doubt disappeared. The disclaimers vanished. The name remained. Michael Reed woke to a town that felt subtly different. At first, He couldn't place it. People still nodded, still smiled, but something was missing. Conversations ended when he approached. Parents guided their children elsewhere. Invitations dried up without explanation. At the market, a shopkeeper avoided his eyes. At the library, the librarian spoke less warmly. During meetings, seats beside him remained empty. No one accused him directly. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. Evelyn sensed the shift before she understood it. Something had changed in the way people spoke around her, careful, restrained, as if testing what she knew. When realization finally reached her, it arrived as a quiet, heavy truth. Her words had not stopped where she left them. Fear settled into her chest, not sharp, but heavy. She replayed the cafe conversation again and again, searching for the moment she could have chosen differently. She tried to fix it. "I didn't hear the full story," she said to one neighbor. "It might not be true," she told another. "I shouldn't have mentioned it," she admitted. But truth, once delayed, struggles to catch up. Her corrections sounded defensive. Her hesitation felt suspicious. And when she finally stopped trying, when she fell silent, her silence was taken as confirmation. The town did what it often did when uncertainty lingered too long. It chose certainty. One night, a group of men confronted Michael. They told themselves they were protecting Riverbend. They did not bring evidence. They did not ask questions. They brought a story that had been repeated enough times to feel real. Michael fled before dawn. By the time Evelyn learned what had happened, the house on the edge of town was already empty. The door stood ajar. The small garden he had planted was left unattended. Weeks later, the truth surfaced quietly. The conversation Evelyn overheard had never been about money. It had been about misplaced paperwork. A misunderstanding. Nothing more. No announcement followed. No apology was made publicly. Life moved on. But Evelyn did not. She began waking earlier, walking longer, speaking less. Because now she understood something Riverbend had never learned in time. Words do not need to be cruel to destroy. They only need to be repeated. And responsibility does not begin after a sentence is spoken. It begins the moment we consider saying it. Stories like this take time and care to craft, stories meant to stay with you long after the video ends. If you value wisdom that doesn't shout, but quietly changes how you see your life, subscribe below. Also, please turn on captions by clicking the CC button at the top right corner of the screen for the best experience. Now, let's continue. After Michael Reed left Riverbend, the town did not speak of him again. His name disappeared from conversations the way names often do when they become inconvenient, quietly, without ceremony. The house he had lived in sat empty at the edge of town, its windows dark, its door shut against a life that had been forced elsewhere. People passed it without looking for long, as if attention itself might reopen something better left closed. Evelyn Harper noticed everything. She noticed how quickly the garden wilted without care. How mail piled up behind the door until someone finally cleared it away. How the town absorbed the absence without reflection. And she noticed something else, something harder to name. The silence inside her had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It pressed against her, heavy and restless, like a question that refused to be answered. She went through her days as she always had, early mornings, quiet work at the clinic, polite conversations, but something beneath the routine had shifted. Listening no longer felt virtuous. It felt insufficient. At night, Evelyn replayed moments she had once considered harmless. The cafe conversation. The pause before she spoke. The way she had told herself uncertainty made sharing acceptable. She examined the memory from every angle, searching for justification. She found none. What troubled her most was not that she had spoken, it was that she had spoken without fully knowing. That she had allowed curiosity to disguise itself as concern. That she had mistaken caution for responsibility. No one blamed her. That made it worse. If someone had accused her openly, she might have defended herself, argued, explained. But the town offered her something far more difficult to carry, permission to forget. She couldn't accept it. That was when she began walking earlier. Not for exercise. Not for clarity. But because the mornings felt honest. Before the town woke, before words began moving again, before decisions were made thoughtlessly. She followed the river path, where the water moved steadily past stones worn smooth by time. It was there, just as the sky began to pale, that she noticed the old man. He sat on the same stone each morning, near the bend where the current slowed. He did not fish. He did not read. He did not speak to anyone who passed. He simply sat. At first, Evelyn assumed he was waiting for something, or someone. But days passed, and his routine never changed. He arrived before sunrise and left once the town began to stir. There was something unsettling about his stillness. It felt deliberate, unapologetic. The town had rules, spoken and unspoken, about usefulness. People valued action, contribution, visibility. The old man offered none of these. And yet, he returned every morning, occupying space without explanation. It irritated her more than she expected. On the fourth morning, curiosity overcame restraint. "Do you come here every day?" she asked, stopping a few steps away. The man did not turn to face her. His gaze remained on the water. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she pressed. He waited before answering, as if considering whether the question deserved a response. "To watch what continues without my interference," he said finally. That was all. No elaboration. No invitation for further conversation. Evelyn stood there for a moment longer, unsettled by the simplicity of the answer. Then she continued walking. The next morning, he was there again. And the morning after that. Weeks passed, and Evelyn found herself adjusting her routine, not consciously, but instinctively, to pass by that stone. Some mornings she greeted him. Some mornings she didn't. He never initiated conversation. She began noticing things during those walks. How the river carried debris away without judgment. How leaves drifted briefly on the surface before disappearing. How the same stone could appear different depending on the light. She did not yet understand why these observations mattered. At the clinic, Evelyn tried to change. She spoke less. Paused longer before responding. When patients gossiped or speculated, she redirected gently, or said nothing at all. At first, the restraint felt awkward. People filled the silence for her. They always did. Words rushed in to occupy empty space, often revealing more than intended. Evelyn noticed how easily assumptions formed when no one slowed them down. Still, doubt followed her. What difference did her silence make? Rumors continued. Opinions spread. The town did not transform because she held her tongue. Some days, the effort felt pointless. One afternoon, she overheard another conversation, another fragment. A familiar tension. A name mentioned with suspicion. Her body reacted instantly. Muscles tightened. Her mind raced ahead to consequences. She could intervene. She could warn someone. She could share the concern carefully. The impulse felt justified. That night, sleep came slowly. The decision weighed on her. Silence, she realized, was not passive, it required endurance. It demanded trust in outcomes she could not control. The next morning, she walked to the river with uncertainty still clinging to her thoughts. The old man was already there. She watched him from a distance. He did not shift, did not fidget, did not check the time. He simply remained. Something in that steadiness unsettled her more than noise ever had. She continued walking without speaking. Later that day, the rumor dissolved on its own. Someone clarified. Someone asked a question before assuming. The tension evaporated without consequence. Nothing happened. No confrontation. No damage. No aftermath. The absence of disaster felt louder than catastrophe ever had. That evening, Evelyn returned to the river and sat on a nearby stone, not beside the old man, not too close. Just near enough to share the quiet. "I thought silence meant indifference," she said finally. The man nodded, as if he had been expecting the sentence. "Silence can be many things," he replied. "Most people confuse it with emptiness." She waited for more. He offered none. Days passed. The walks became routine. Evelyn began to notice something subtle but profound. The more she restrained her words, the more carefully she listened, to others and to herself. She realized how often she had spoken to relieve her own discomfort. How easily concern could become performance. How quickly curiosity turned into contribution. One morning, The stone was empty. Evelyn stopped short. The absence bothered her more than she expected. The space where the old man usually sat felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. She walked on, unsettled. The following morning, he returned. Relief surprised her. She did not speak that day. Neither did he. But something had shifted. Evelyn no longer saw silence as avoidance. She began to see it as a form of care, a pause wide enough to hold responsibility. Michael Reed's empty house still stood at the edge of town. The damage could not be undone. But something else had begun quietly, without announcement. A discipline. A restraint. A different way of carrying words before releasing them. And Evelyn understood, though she could not yet explain it. Not every truth needs immediate expression. Not every thought deserves a voice. Some wisdom arrives only when we learn how to wait. The discipline Evelyn Harper had begun to practice did not announce itself with clarity. There was no moment she could point to and say, "This is where I changed." Instead, it revealed itself slowly, in hesitation, in pauses, in the quiet weight that settled between thought and speech. Silence became something she carried, not something she escaped into. At first, it felt unnatural. Words still formed easily in her mind. Opinions arrived fully shaped. Observations begged for expression. But now, between impulse and action, there existed a space, a brief, uncomfortable stillness where she had to decide whether release was necessary. That space demanded honesty. At the clinic, co-workers noticed the change before she did. Evelyn listened longer. Responded later. When asked for opinions, she offered fewer, but more deliberate words. Some mistook it for distance. "You've been quiet lately, Linda Morrison," a nurse she'd worked alongside for years, said one afternoon. Evelyn smiled lightly. "Just thinking more." Linda shrugged. "Must be nice." But thinking more was not nice. It was exhausting. Each withheld sentence felt heavy, as if unspoken words accumulated inside her, pressing for acknowledgement. There were moments she longed for the ease of speech, the relief of sharing, the temporary comfort of contribution. Silence did not reward her immediately. The town still buzzed with speculation. Opinions continued to circulate. She realized something unsettling. Her voice had never been as necessary as she'd assumed. This realization stung. One evening, Evelyn attended a small community meeting about clinic funding. It was the kind of gathering where conversations spilled into the hallway, where frustrations were aired freely and often carelessly. During a break, she overheard a familiar tone, a whisper sharpened by judgment. A group stood near the window, speaking in lowered voices. A name surfaced. Thomas Hale, a local contractor. The word dishonest followed, then a string of assumptions built on partial information. Evelyn felt the familiar tightening in her chest. This time, she knew the pattern. She had seen this story before, how it began, how it traveled, how it ended. The urge to intervene rose quickly. She could warn someone. She could challenge the assumption. She could stop the sentence before it ran. But another thought followed, quieter, steadier. What if her intervention only accelerated it? She stepped away without speaking. The choice felt wrong. Cowardly. Passive. That night, doubt kept her awake. Silence, she realized, was not morally neutral. Choosing not to speak carried its own consequences. The next morning, she walked to the river earlier than usual, uncertainty heavy in her chest. The old man was already there. He sat as he always did, hands folded, gaze fixed on the water. Evelyn stopped beside him, the question forming before she could stop it. "What if silence lets harm continue?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. "Then silence becomes neglect," he said finally. "But that is not the same as restraint." She frowned. "How do you know the difference?" He turned toward her for the first time, his eyes clear and steady. "By asking who the silence serves," he said. The words settled slowly. Evelyn continued her walk, turning the question over in her mind. Who did her silence serve? Herself? Her comfort? Or the truth? The following days tested her resolve. Rumors about Thomas Hale gained momentum. Assumptions hardened. Conversations grew bolder. This time, Evelyn had information, verified, clear, and contextual. She knew the accusation was unfounded. Silence no longer felt responsible. At the next opportunity, she spoke. Not dramatically. Not defensively. She corrected a detail. Asked a clarifying question. Offered context without accusation. The room shifted. People paused. Someone admitted uncertainty. Another reconsidered. The story slowed. Evelyn felt no relief, only alignment. She understood then that wisdom was not about speaking less or more. It was about speaking with intention. Restraint did not mean withdrawal. It meant discipline. Days later, she returned to the river. The stone was empty. One day passed. Then another. Evelyn found herself looking for the old man more than she expected. The absence unsettled her, not because she depended on him, but because his presence had anchored something inside her. On the fourth morning, she sat on the stone herself. She did not imitate his posture. She did not attempt to replicate his ritual. She simply sat and watched the water move. For the first time, she noticed how the river carried sound. How voices on the far bank reached her distorted and incomplete. How easily meaning could be altered by distance. The symbolism felt uncomfortably clear. That afternoon, a letter arrived at the clinic. It was forwarded mail, addressed to Michael Reed, then marked return to sender. The receptionist had opened it accidentally before realizing the mistake. Inside was a single sheet of paper. An apology. Written by someone in Riverbend. Unsigned. Evelyn held the letter longer than necessary. The apology would never reach him. But the impulse behind it mattered. She began to understand something deeper. Words, when delayed too long, lose their destination. And silence, when misused, can become avoidance. The discipline she was learning was not about withholding speech. It was about carrying words long enough to know whether they deserved release. When the old man returned weeks later, Evelyn was already seated on a nearby stone. He nodded once, as if acknowledging progress. "Do you still come here to watch the river?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "No." "Why then?" "To remember that not everything that moves needs my help," he said. Evelyn smiled, not because she fully understood, but because she no longer needed to. The weight inside her had shifted. She carried fewer words now. But the ones she carried mattered. By the time Evelyn Harper realized that restraint had changed her, it was already woven into the way she moved through the world. It showed up in moments so small they were easy to miss. In the pause before answering a question. In the way she listened without preparing a response. In the calm that followed when she allowed a thought to pass without chasing it into speech. Silence was no longer something she endured. It was something she chose. At the clinic, the change became unmistakable. Evelyn spoke less frequently, but when she did, people listened. Not because she demanded attention, but because her words arrived with weight. They were considered, measured, necessary. She no longer filled space out of habit. One afternoon, a disagreement arose between two staff members, voices sharpened by fatigue, assumptions rising quickly to the surface. Evelyn watched the tension build, recognizing the familiar pattern, fragments becoming conclusions, conclusions seeking confirmation. She waited. When she finally spoke, it was not to settle the argument, but to ask a single question. What are we actually certain about? The room went quiet. That question slowed everything. People reconsidered their positions. Details were clarified. The conflict dissolved, not dramatically, but completely. Evelyn felt no pride. Only clarity. She began to understand that wisdom often entered a room disguised as restraint. Outside the clinic, Riverbend remained unchanged on the surface. The same streets. The same routines. The same rhythm of conversations rising and falling like tides. But Evelyn experienced it differently now. She noticed how often people spoke to ease their own anxiety. How words were used as shields, as distractions, as ways to avoid sitting with uncertainty. She recognized that she had once done the same. The old man by the river continued to appear and disappear without pattern. Some weeks he came daily. Others, not at all. Evelyn no longer searched for him anxiously. His presence had already served its purpose. One morning, as she sat by the water alone, a familiar memory returned, not as pain, but as clarity. Michael Reed. His empty house still stood at the edge of town. The blue door weathered. The garden overtaken by weeds. No one spoke of him now. The town had folded the incident into its collective past, labeled it unfortunate, and moved on. But Evelyn had not. She had stopped measuring responsibility by intention and started measuring it by impact. That shift changed everything. Late one afternoon, a letter arrived. This one was addressed to Evelyn. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The return address foreign. She recognized the name immediately. Michael Reed. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was brief. Thoughtful. Free of accusation. He wrote about starting over in a new town. About how long it took to trust people again. About the children he now taught. Children who didn't know his past, only his patience. Near the end, he wrote. I don't know exactly how the story began in Riverbend. But I've learned something from it. Not every wound needs revenge to heal. Some only need distance. Evelyn read the line several times. He had not written to blame her. He had not written to demand anything. He had written to close a chapter. Tears came quietly, without drama. That evening, Evelyn walked to the river earlier than usual. The sky was heavy with clouds, the water dark and slow. The old man was there. She sat beside him for the first time. I received a letter today, she said. He nodded. I wanted to explain myself, she continued. To apologize properly. To tell the full truth. She waited, unsure why she was speaking. But I didn't, she added. The old man turned toward her. Why not? Because the apology would have been for me, she said slowly. Not for him. The man smiled, not kindly, not approvingly, but knowingly. That is when silence becomes wisdom, he said. They sat together, watching the river absorb fallen leaves without pause or preference. Evelyn realized then that the most difficult restraint was not silence in the face of gossip, but silence in the face of guilt. Knowing when words would soothe the speaker more than the listener. Days passed. Evelyn wrote a letter of her own. She did not send it. Instead, she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not as avoidance, but as acknowledgement. Some words, she understood now, were meant to be carried, not delivered. The discipline she had learned was no longer effortful. It had become identity. She no longer rushed to be heard. No longer feared being misunderstood. She trusted the space between thought and speech. One morning, she returned to the river and found the stone empty. She sat anyway. The water moved as it always had, unconcerned, persistent, patient. Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time since everything began, the silence felt complete. Not heavy. Not restless. But whole. Years later, when people in Riverbend spoke about the past, they rarely spoke about Michael Reed. Time had softened the edges of that season. Memory, selective as always, trimmed away discomfort and left behind only vague impressions, an unease no one could quite explain, a story without a clear beginning or ending. But some things do not fade. They settle. Evelyn Harper still lived in the same house, walked the same streets, and worked at the same clinic. On the surface, nothing about her life suggested transformation. She had not moved away. She had not changed careers. She had not announced any new philosophy or taken on the role of moral guide. And yet, those who paid attention sensed something different. Evelyn spoke rarely at town gatherings, but when she did, conversations shifted. Not because she was persuasive, but because her words arrived without urgency. She did not compete for attention. She waited until the moment required clarity. People trusted her, not because she was always right, but because she never spoke carelessly. In Riverbend, where words once ran unchecked, her restraint stood out quietly. At the clinic, younger staff members often sought her out, not for advice exactly, but for perspective. They noticed how she listened fully before responding. How she asked questions that slowed conclusions instead of accelerating them. One afternoon, a new nurse, Rachel Miller, approached her with visible frustration. "I don't understand how you stay out of it," Rachel said. "The gossip. The speculation. Everyone's always talking." Evelyn considered the comment carefully. "I don't stay out of it," she said finally. "I just decide what I'm willing to carry." Rachel frowned. "Carry?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Every sentence has weight. Once you pick it up, It's yours until you set it down. The nurse nodded slowly, uncertain but thoughtful. That evening, Evelyn walked by the old house at the edge of town. The blue door had been repainted by new owners. The garden was alive again, different hands, different care. Life had reclaimed the space. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then continued walking. The river path remained her constant. The stone where the old man once sat was smooth from years of weather and presence. He had not appeared in a long time. Evelyn no longer wondered where he had gone. Some figures, she understood now, were not meant to stay. They arrived long enough to be noticed. And then they left. One autumn morning, as leaves drifted along the water's surface, Evelyn noticed a young boy sitting on the stone. He couldn't have been more than 10. He skipped pebbles across the river, counting under his breath. She slowed her steps. "You come here often?" she asked gently. The boy shrugged. "My grandfather used to." Evelyn smiled. "Did he say why?" "He said it helped him remember," the boy replied. "Remember what?" The boy thought for a moment. "That not everything needs fixing." Evelyn felt something loosen inside her. She continued her walk, the boy's words echoing quietly. Later that day, a disagreement arose at the clinic, another misunderstanding, another tension fueled by partial information. Evelyn listened, asked questions, offered context. The situation resolved itself without damage. She felt no triumph, only gratitude. That night, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table and opened the drawer where the unsent letter remained. She read it once more, not with regret, but with recognition. The words no longer felt urgent. She folded the letter again and placed it back. Some sentences, she had learned, do their work simply by being written. In Riverbend, conversations still moved quickly. Opinions still formed. The town had not become wise overnight. But Evelyn had. And sometimes that is how wisdom spreads, not by instruction, not by correction, but by example. Silence, she now understood, was not the absence of speech. It was the presence of care. It was the space where responsibility lived. The river flowed on, carrying leaves, reflections, and the echo of voices long gone. It did not rush. It did not resist. It simply moved forward, holding what it was given until it no longer needed to. Evelyn stood at its edge listening, not for what needed to be said, but for what needed to remain unsaid. Because the most powerful sentences, she had learned, are often the ones we choose not to release. And in that restraint, lives are quietly protected. Stories like this aren't about motivation, they're about becoming. If this resonated, like the video so it reaches someone who needs it. Subscribe for more wisdom-driven stories. And remember, progress is happening, even when it's silent.